The summer heat of 2024 pressed down on San Antonio like a heavy blanket, the kind of oppressive Texas humidity that made even the locals seek refuge in air-conditioned buildings. But inside Floor's country store, the legendary honky-tonk that had hosted everyone from Willie Nelson to Hank Williams Jr., the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Word had spread quietly through the local music community that George Strait, the king of country music himself, would be making an unannounced appearance at the venue's weekly songwriter night. At 72 years old, George Harvey Strait Sr. remained an imposing figure in country music. Despite officially retiring from touring in 2014 after his farewell tour became the highest-grossing country music tour in history, he had never truly stepped away from music. His silver hair was still mostly hidden beneath his signature black resistal hat, his frame still tall and lean from decades of ranch work, and his presence still commanded respect wherever he went. Tonight was different, though. This wasn't a scheduled performance or a publicity appearance. George had driven the 30 miles from his ranch in Cotulla on a whim, feeling the pull of live music and authentic connection that had sustained him throughout his 5-decade career. He missed the intimacy of small venues, the immediate feedback of audiences who came for the music rather than the spectacle. The decision to come to Floor's had been spontaneous. Earlier that day, George had been working cattle on his ranch when his longtime friend and fellow musician, Robert Earl Keane, had called with news that troubled him. A young songwriter from Austin, someone George had mentored briefly, had been the target of a vicious social media campaign questioning his authenticity as a country artist. The criticism had been personal, cruel, and seemed designed to destroy rather than critique. "It's getting worse out there, George," Robert Earl had said during their phone conversation. "These keyboard warriors are tearing apart anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of what country music should be. This kid's music is real as anything we ever did, but they're calling him fake because he grew up in the suburbs instead of on a farm." The conversation had struck a nerve with George. Throughout his career, he had witnessed the music industry's tendency to prioritize image over substance, marketing over authenticity. But the rise of social media had amplified these problems, creating echo chambers where anonymous critics could destroy artists' reputations without ever having to defend their own positions or credentials. As George parked his F-150 in the gravel lot outside Floor's, he reflected on how much the music business had changed since his early days. The industry that had once been dominated by talent scouts looking for authentic voices had become increasingly corporate, driven by algorithms and streaming numbers rather than genuine connection between artist and audience. The venue itself hadn't changed much over the decades. Floor's still maintained its rustic charm, with weathered wooden walls covered in photographs of legendary performers, concrete floors that had absorbed decades of spilled beer and shuffling boots, and a stage that had witnessed countless dreams being born and broken. The air still carried the familiar mixture of cigarette smoke, barbecue, and sawdust that defined authentic Texas honky-tonks. George entered through the side door, hoping to avoid recognition for as long as possible. He wanted to observe the scene, to gauge the mood and energy of the room before deciding whether to participate. The crowd was typical for a Wednesday night songwriter session, a mixture of aspiring musicians, industry professionals, and regular folks who simply loved live music. On stage, a young woman with a guitar was performing an original song about small-town dreams and big-city disappointments. Her voice was strong and clear, her lyrics honest and well-crafted, but George could see the nervousness in her posture, the way she gripped the microphone stand a little too tightly. He remembered that feeling well, the vulnerability that came with sharing your most personal thoughts and emotions with a room full of strangers. As George found a seat at a corner table, partially hidden in the shadows, he noticed a group of men at the bar who seemed more interested in their phones than the performance. They were well-dressed, clearly not locals, and their body language suggested the kind of industry professionals who attended these events to scout talent rather than enjoy music. The young woman finished her song to polite applause, and the host, a veteran musician named Jake Martinez, whom George had known for years, called up the next performer. This one was a middle-aged man with calloused hands and worn jeans, the kind of authentic working-class appearance that country music marketing departments tried to manufacture. His song was about losing his factory job and struggling to provide for his family, and every word carried the weight of lived experience. The industry professionals at the bar barely looked up from their phones during his performance, their disinterest obvious to anyone paying attention. George felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same frustration he had experienced countless times over the years when he witnessed genuine talent being overlooked in favor of more marketable but less authentic alternatives. After the second performer finished, George heard one of the industry professionals make a comment that made his blood boil. The man, who appeared to be in his 40s with perfectly styled hair and an expensive watch, was speaking loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. "These small-town wannabes are all the same," the man said dismissively. "They think that just because they've got a sob story and a guitar, they can make it in Nashville. But they don't understand that this business is about brand development, social media presence, and crossover potential. Authenticity doesn't sell records anymore. Relatability does. And there's a difference." His companions nodded in agreement, one of them adding, "The streaming numbers don't lie. Country music fans want polished production, attractive performers, and songs that test well with focus groups. These open mic nights are basically just therapy sessions for people who can't accept that their time has passed." George felt his jaw tighten as he listened to the conversation. These men represented everything he had spent his career fighting against: the reduction of art to mere commerce, the prioritization of market research over emotional truth, the dismissal of authentic experience in favor of manufactured relatability. The third performer of the evening was a young man in his early 20s, clearly nervous but determined. His name was Marcus Rivera, and George recognized him as the songwriter Robert Earl had mentioned, the one who had been targeted by the social media campaign. Marcus had driven down from Austin specifically to play at Flores, hoping that the supportive atmosphere of the legendary venue might help rebuild his confidence. Marcus's first song was a beautiful ballad about his grandfather's immigration from Mexico and the sacrifices made by previous generations to give their children better opportunities. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, the lyrics deeply personal yet universally relatable. It was exactly the kind of authentic storytelling that had always been the backbone of great country music. But as Marcus began his second song, George noticed the industry professionals at the bar beginning to pay attention, and not in a good way. They were looking at their phones, then at Marcus, then back at their phones, clearly doing real-time research on the young performer. "Wait a minute," one of them said loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Isn't this the kid who's been getting roasted online for being a fake cowboy? I saw the tweets. Apparently he grew up in the suburbs and never worked on a farm in his life. He's basically cultural appropriation in cowboy boots." The comment was loud enough that Marcus heard it from the stage. George could see the young man's confidence crumble in real time, his voice wavering as he tried to continue his song while processing the public humiliation. The room's energy shifted uncomfortably, with some audience members looking embarrassed for Marcus, while others turned to see who had made the comment. Marcus struggled through the rest of his song, his performance suffering as the weight of the criticism settled on his shoulders. When he finished, the applause was scattered and uncomfortable, nothing like the enthusiastic response his talent deserved. As Marcus packed up his guitar with obvious haste, clearly wanting to escape the venue as quickly as possible, The industry professional who had made the initial comment stood up and addressed the room in a voice that carried false authority. "I think this is a perfect example of what's wrong with country music today," the man announced, his tone suggesting he expected everyone to hang on his words. "We've got people appropriating a culture they've never lived, singing about experiences they've never had, all because they think a cowboy hat and a sad song are enough to make them authentic country artists." He gestured toward Marcus, who was now frozen near the stage, humiliated and trapped by the public nature of the attack. "Real country music comes from real experience," the man continued. "It comes from people who've actually lived the life they're singing about. Not from suburban kids who learned about ranch life from watching movies and think they can fake their way into Nashville by copying the aesthetics without understanding the substance." The room had gone completely quiet now, with all attention focused on the unfolding confrontation. George could see the pain and humiliation in Marcus's eyes, and he felt a protective anger rising in his chest. This was exactly the kind of gatekeeping bullshit that had always plagued country music. The idea that authenticity could be measured by zip codes and biographical details rather than emotional truth and artistic skill. The industry professional wasn't finished with his lecture. "I mean, look at him," he said, pointing directly at Marcus. "Everything about him screams manufactured authenticity. The hat, the boots, the whole aesthetic, it's all costume. And those songs, probably written by committee to hit specific demographic markers. This is what happens when country music becomes a business plan instead of an art form." Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The young man who had walked onto the stage with hope and determination was now clearly devastated, his confidence shattered by the public humiliation. George could see him struggling with whether to respond or simply flee. That's when George Harvey Strait Sr., the king of country music, decided he had heard enough. George stood up slowly from his corner table, his movement deliberate and purposeful. At first, only a few people noticed. The venue was dimly lit, and he had been sitting in relative obscurity. But as he stepped forward into the light, a ripple of recognition began to spread through the crowd. "Holy shit," someone whispered near the bar. "Is that George Strait?" The industry professional, who had been delivering his lecture about authenticity, turned to see what was causing the disturbance, and his face went pale when he realized who was approaching. George Strait's presence was unmistakable. Even at 72, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove but everything to defend. "Excuse me," George said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent room. His tone was polite, but carried an undertone of steel that anyone familiar with Texas culture would recognize. "I couldn't help but overhear your commentary about authenticity in country music, and I wondered if I might offer a different perspective." The industry professional's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. Around the room, people were pulling out their phones, recognizing that they were about to witness something significant. Marcus Rivera stood frozen near the stage, his guitar case half-packed, looking like he couldn't decide whether this was a rescue or just another layer of humiliation. "Mr. Strait," the industry professional finally managed to say, his voice much less confident than it had been moments before. We weren't expecting... I mean, it's an honor to meet you." George nodded politely but didn't extend his hand. "I'm sure it is. Now, I heard you explaining to this young man and everyone else in this room about what makes an authentic country artist. I found your analysis fascinating, and I thought maybe we could explore it a little deeper." The man looked around nervously, suddenly aware that every eye in the room was on him. The confident lecturer had been replaced by someone who clearly understood he was in dangerous territory. "Sir, I was just making an observation about this young man's authenticity," George interrupted, his voice remaining calm but gaining intensity. You seem to know quite a bit about his background, his motivations, and his qualifications to sing country music. I'm curious, what are your qualifications to make such judgments? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Around the room, people were leaning forward in their seats, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. "Well, I work in the industry," the man replied weakly. "I'm a talent scout for—" "A talent scout," George repeated, his tone suggesting that the title was somehow lacking. "That's interesting. So you identify talent for a living. Tell me, what talent did you identify in this young man's performance tonight?" The man shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this line of questioning. Well, technically he has some skill, but the authenticity issues..." "Authenticity issues," George said, nodding as if he were considering the concept for the first time. "Help me understand something. I grew up on a ranch in Pearsall, Texas. I've worked cattle my whole life. According to your criteria, that should make me more authentic than someone who grew up in the suburbs. But let me ask you this. Which one of us has actually lived the experience of being criticized and humiliated in front of a room full of strangers for daring to chase his dreams?" The talent scout's face was turning red, but George wasn't finished. "You see, I've been fortunate enough to have a long career in this business, and I've learned something important along the way. Authenticity isn't about where you're born or what your daddy did for a living. Authenticity is about truth, emotional truth, artistic truth, the truth that comes from being willing to stand up and share your heart with strangers, knowing that some of them might try to tear it apart." George turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying the authority of 5 decades in the music business. "This young man got up on that stage tonight and sang about his grandfather's journey to America, about the sacrifices previous generations made for their children. He sang it with genuine emotion, with respect for the story he was telling, and with the kind of vulnerability that real artistry requires. The fact that he didn't grow up on a ranch doesn't make that story less true or less valuable." Marcus Rivera was staring at George with something approaching awe, tears beginning to form in his eyes as he realized that his musical hero was defending him. "Now," George continued, turning back to the talent scout, "you mentioned that authenticity doesn't sell records anymore. That's an interesting business perspective. Tell me about your most successful signings. What records have you been responsible for that have connected with audiences and stood the test of time?" The man's silence was deafening. Around the room, people were beginning to murmur among themselves, sensing that the industry professional was being systematically dismantled by someone who actually knew what he was talking about. "I see," George said, after the silence had stretched uncomfortably long. "Well, let me share some of my experience with you. I've been blessed to record 60 #1 hits over the course of my career. I've sold over 120 million records worldwide. I've been inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. And you know what the secret to all of that success was?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Authenticity, not the kind of authenticity that comes from biographical details or costume choices, but the kind that comes from emotional honesty, from being willing to sing about universal human experiences, love, loss, hope, disappointment, in a way that makes people feel less alone in the world. George gestured toward Marcus. "This young man did exactly that tonight. He took a personal family story and transformed it into something that everyone in this room could relate to, regardless of their own background. That's what real artists do. They find the universal in the personal." The talent scout was looking around the room for support, but finding none. His companions had distanced themselves from him, clearly wanting no part of the confrontation. "But let's talk about your other point," George continued. "You said that real country music comes from people who've actually lived the life they're singing about. That's an interesting theory. Tell me, have you ever been heartbroken?" "What?" the man stammered. "Have you ever been heartbroken?" George repeated. Have you ever lost someone you loved? Have you ever felt like the world was against you? Have you ever been so proud of your family that it brought tears to your eyes? Of course, but then you've lived the life that country music sings about, George said simply. Because country music isn't about cowboys and farms and pickup trucks. That's just the setting. Country music is about the human experience. It's about the emotions and struggles and triumphs that every person faces, regardless of where they grew up or what their parents did for a living. George walked closer to the talent scout, his presence somehow becoming even more commanding. You want to know what's really damaging to country music? It's not suburban kids who love the music enough to dedicate their lives to it. It's people like you who think authenticity can be measured by demographic surveys and market research. It's the idea that artists should be judged by their backstory instead of their art. The room was completely silent now, with everyone hanging on George's every word. This wasn't just a defense of Marcus Rivera, it was a master class in what country music was really supposed to be about. I've had the privilege of knowing and working with some of the greatest artists in country music history, George continued. Willie Nelson, Merle Haggard, Dolly Parton, Johnny Cash. You know what they all had in common? It wasn't their biographical details. It was their ability to tell stories that mattered, to connect with audiences on a human level, to make people feel something real. George turned back toward Marcus, his expression softening. This young man has that gift. I could hear it in his voice, see it in the way the audience responded before you decided to tear him down. He has something that can't be taught or manufactured, the ability to make people feel less alone in the world through music. Then George turned back to the talent scout, and his voice took on a harder edge. But you'd rather destroy that gift than nurture it, because it doesn't fit your narrow definition of what country music should be. You'd rather judge him by his zip code than his heart. That's not just bad business, it's bad humanity. The talent scout was clearly searching for a way to respond, to salvage some dignity from the situation. But George wasn't finished with him yet. George Strait had spent his entire career avoiding public confrontations, preferring to let his music speak for itself. But watching a young artist being publicly humiliated for daring to follow his dreams had awakened something protective and fierce in the country music legend. The talent scout, who had appointed himself as the arbiter of authenticity, was about to learn why George had earned the title King of Country Music through more than just record sales. I have a proposition for you, George said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of commanding respect without demanding it. Since you seem to have such strong opinions about what makes an authentic country artist, I think it's only fair that you demonstrate your expertise. The talent scout's face went from red to pale in the span of seconds. Around the room, people were leaning forward in anticipation, sensing that something significant was about to happen. I don't understand, the man stammered, though his expression suggested he understood perfectly well and didn't like where this was heading. It's simple, George replied. You've just spent the last 10 minutes lecturing this room about authenticity, about what qualifies someone to sing country music, about the difference between real artists and manufactured ones. I think everyone here would benefit from seeing those principles put into practice. George gestured toward the stage, where Marcus Rivera was still standing, caught between wanting to flee and wanting to see how this confrontation would resolve. I'm inviting you to take that stage and show us what authentic country music looks like. Sing us a song about your life, your experiences, your truth. Show this young man and everyone else here how it's supposed to be done. The challenge was issued with such calm confidence that it took a moment for its full implications to sink in. George Strait, the most successful country artist of all time, was essentially calling out the talent scout to put his money where his mouth was. I'm not a performer, the man protested weakly. I'm on the business side of things. I don't... "Oh, but that's perfect," George interrupted, his tone suggesting genuine enthusiasm for the idea. "You understand the business better than any of us. You know what audiences want to hear, what makes a song commercially viable, what separates the professionals from the amateurs. Surely someone with your expertise could demonstrate these principles for the benefit of everyone here." The trap was beautifully constructed. If the man refused, he would look cowardly in front of the entire room, undermining his authority to criticize others. If he accepted, he would have to back up his harsh words with actual performance, something George clearly suspected he was incapable of doing. "Look, Mr. Strait," the talent scout said, desperation creeping into his voice, "I have tremendous respect for your career and your contributions to country music. But I think there's been a misunderstanding. I wasn't trying to attack anyone personally. I was just making observations about market trends and commercial viability." George nodded as if he were seriously considering this explanation. Market trends and commercial viability. That's interesting. So your criticism of this young man wasn't based on the quality of his music or the sincerity of his performance, but on your assessment of his commercial potential? Well, partially, yes. The industry has changed. Streaming numbers, social media presence, demographic appeal, these things matter more than they used to. "I see," George said. "So when you called him a fake cowboy, when you suggested he was culturally appropriating a lifestyle he'd never lived, when you dismissed his music as manufactured authenticity, all of that was really just market analysis." The man was trapped between contradictory explanations, and everyone in the room could see it. He had been caught switching between moral criticism and business analysis, depending on which seemed more defensible in the moment. "Because if that's the case," George continued, "then your expertise in market analysis should make you perfectly qualified to demonstrate what audiences actually want to hear. Show us a performance that combines authenticity with commercial appeal. Give us a masterclass in how it's supposed to be done." Around the room, people were beginning to smile as they watched the industry professionals squirm. Some were recording the interaction on their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would be shared widely across social media. Marcus Rivera had stopped packing his guitar and was watching the exchange with growing amazement. The young man, who had been ready to flee in humiliation, was now seeing his tormentor systematically dismantled by someone who actually understood both the artistic and commercial sides of the music business. "Or maybe," George said, his voice taking on a different tone, "you'd prefer a different kind of demonstration. Maybe instead of performing, you could share some of your success stories with us. Tell us about the artists you've discovered and developed, the careers you've launched, the records that have succeeded because of your guidance." The silence that followed was deafening. The talent scout looked around the room desperately, seeking support or an escape route, but finding neither. My work is more behind the scenes," he finally managed. "I don't typically discuss specific artists or projects in public forums." George smiled, but it wasn't a particularly warm expression. "How convenient. So you can criticize other people's work in public, but you can't discuss your own accomplishments. That seems like an interesting double standard." Jake Martinez, the host of the Songwriter Night, had been watching this exchange with growing amazement. He stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to support both George and Marcus, while also managing the situation. "Mr. Strait," Jake said respectfully, "would you be willing to share some of your thoughts about what you heard tonight, about authenticity in country music and what you look for in new artists?" George nodded, understanding that Jake was giving him a platform to turn this confrontation into something more constructive. "I'd be happy to," George replied. He turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the venue. I've been in this business for over 50 years, and I've seen it change in ways both good and bad. The technology has improved, the production values have gotten better, and artists have more opportunities to reach audiences than ever before. But some things haven't changed and shouldn't change. He gestured toward Marcus. What I heard from this young man tonight was storytelling. Real storytelling, about real experiences and real emotions. His grandfather's immigration story might be specific to his family, but the themes, sacrifice, hope, the love between generations, those are universal. George looked directly at the talent scout as he continued. Anyone who thinks that story is less authentic because the storyteller grew up in the suburbs instead of on a ranch is missing the entire point of what country music is supposed to do. We're not documentarians. We're interpreters of the human experience. The room was completely focused on George now, with people hanging on every word. This was more than just a defense of one young artist. It was a statement about the values that should guide the entire music industry. I grew up on a ranch, and I've sung about ranch life throughout my career, but I've also sung about heartbreak, even though I've been happily married to the same woman for over 50 years. I've sung about bars and drinking, even though I'm not much of a drinker. I've sung about regret and loss and loneliness because those are human experiences that resonate with people regardless of my personal biography. George paused, letting his words sink in. The question isn't whether an artist has lived every experience they sing about. The question is whether they can make those experiences feel real and meaningful to their audience. And that's exactly what I heard tonight from Marcus. The young man in question was now openly crying, overwhelmed by having his musical hero not just defend him, but validate his artistic choices in such a public way. As for market trends and commercial viability, George continued, looking directly at the talent scout, let me share something I've learned over 5 decades in this business. The most commercially successful country music has always been the most emotionally authentic. When artists try to manufacture relatability instead of sharing genuine emotion, audiences can tell the difference. George's voice took on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. You can't focus group your way to authenticity. You can't A/B test your way to emotional truth. You can't algorithm your way to art. The only way to create music that truly connects with people is to be honest about your own experiences and emotions, and to trust that other people will recognize that honesty when they hear it. The talent scout was looking increasingly uncomfortable, clearly realizing that his industry credentials were meaningless in the face of George's actual track record of success. Now, George said, his voice becoming more pointed, I want to address something else that was said tonight. The suggestion that this young man is somehow appropriating a culture that isn't his. That's not just wrong, it's dangerous. George's voice carried a hint of anger now, the first real emotion he had shown during the entire confrontation. Country music has always been about inclusion, not exclusion. It's about finding common ground between people of different backgrounds, different experiences, different walks of life. When we start saying that only certain people are allowed to sing country music, we're betraying everything this genre has ever stood for. He gestured toward the crowd. Look around this room. You've got ranchers and teachers and mechanics and students and retirees and 20-somethings all sitting together, all connected by music. That's what country music is supposed to do, bring people together, not drive them apart. George looked directly at Marcus as he delivered his next point. This young man's family story is part of the American story, and the American story is what country music has always been about. The idea that his music is somehow less authentic because his family's journey included immigration instead of homesteading is not just wrong. It's un-American. The applause that followed was spontaneous and thunderous. People weren't just clapping for George's words. They were expressing their support for the values he was articulating and their rejection of the exclusionary gatekeeping they had witnessed. But George wasn't finished yet. He had one more point to make, and it would be the most important of all. As the applause died down, George Strait remained standing in the center of the room, his presence commanding attention without any apparent effort. The talent scout who had started this confrontation was now sitting quietly, clearly hoping the situation would somehow resolve itself without further humiliation. But George had one more lesson to deliver, and it would be the most important of the evening. "There's something else I want to talk about," George said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Something about what authenticity really means in this business, and why it matters more than ever in today's world." He walked closer to the stage where Marcus Rivera was standing, his expression becoming more compassionate. "Marcus, I want you to know that what happened to you tonight, the criticism, the questioning of your authenticity, the public humiliation, that's not unique to you. Every artist who's ever mattered has faced similar challenges. The difference is in how you respond to them." George turned to address the entire room again. "I want to tell you about something that happened to me early in my career. It was 1981, and I had just released my second album. I was performing at a festival in Oklahoma, and there was a music critic there from a major Nashville publication. After my set, he wrote a review that basically said I was too traditional, too boring, that I'd never amount to anything because I wasn't willing to evolve with the times. The room was completely silent, everyone hanging on George's words. That review could have destroyed my confidence. I was young, I was trying to establish myself in Nashville, and here was an industry expert telling me that everything I believed about music was wrong. I had a choice to make. I could change my style to fit what the critics wanted, or I could trust my instincts and keep doing what felt right to me." George paused, his eyes finding Marcus in the crowd. "I chose to trust my instincts. And you know what happened? That album, Straight from the Heart, became my first #1 hit. The song that the critics said was too traditional and boring, Foolhardy Memory, spent a week at the top of the country charts. There was a murmur of appreciation from the crowd, people recognizing the lesson George was sharing. But here's the thing," George continued. "The success wasn't the important part. The important part was learning that authenticity isn't about proving yourself to critics or industry professionals. It's about staying true to your artistic vision, even when people try to convince you to compromise it." George looked directly at the talent scout as he spoke his next words. "The people who matter, the fans, the audience, the folks who buy tickets and records, they can tell the difference between someone who's being authentic and someone who's just playing a role. They might not be able to articulate what that difference is, but they can feel it. And that feeling is what creates the connection between artist and audience that makes careers last." Marcus wiped tears from his eyes, clearly moved by having his hero share such personal insights in his defense. "Now, I want to address something else that was said tonight," George continued, his voice becoming more serious. "The suggestion that authenticity in country music can be measured by biographical details, where you grew up, what your parents did for a living, whether you've ever worked on a ranch." George removed his hat, running his fingers through his silver hair in a gesture that somehow made him seem more human and approachable. "I've been blessed to know and work with some of the greatest artists in country music history, and let me tell you something, they came from all kinds of backgrounds. Dolly Parton grew up dirt poor in the Tennessee mountains, but so did a lot of people who never wrote a memorable song. Johnny Cash grew up on a cotton farm, but that's not what made Ring of Fire a classic." George replaced his hat, adjusting it to the perfect angle. What made those artists great wasn't their backstories, it was their ability to transform their experiences into something universal. They took their specific circumstances and found the emotions and truths that everyone could relate to. That's what real authenticity looks like. George gestured toward Marcus again. This young man did exactly that tonight. He took his family's specific story and found the universal themes within it: love, sacrifice, hope for the future. The fact that his grandfather was an immigrant rather than a homesteader doesn't make those themes less valid or less country. The talent scout was looking increasingly uncomfortable, but George wasn't letting him off the hook yet. "But let's talk about what happened here tonight from a different angle," George said, his voice taking on a more pointed tone. "Let's talk about the difference between constructive criticism and destructive gatekeeping." George walked closer to the table where the industry professionals were sitting, his presence somehow becoming more commanding. In any artistic field, criticism plays an important role. Good critics help audiences understand what they're hearing, they provide context and analysis, and they hold artists accountable for the quality of their work. But what happened here tonight wasn't criticism, it was something else entirely. George's voice carried a hint of disgust as he continued. What happened here was someone using their perceived authority to tear down a young artist for the simple crime of daring to pursue his dreams. That's not criticism, that's bullying, and it has no place in country music or any other form of art. The room was completely silent now, everyone understanding the seriousness of what George was saying. Real criticism focuses on the work, not the person. It offers specific insights about what works and what doesn't, and it provides constructive suggestions for improvement. But what this young man experienced tonight was a personal attack disguised as professional assessment. George looked directly at the talent scout. When you question someone's authenticity based on their zip code rather than their artistry, when you dismiss their music because of demographics rather than quality, when you use your platform to humiliate rather than educate, you're not serving the music industry, you're damaging it. The talent scout finally found his voice, though it was much smaller than it had been at the beginning of the evening. "Mr. Strait, I think you may have misunderstood my intentions. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was just—" "You were just what?" George interrupted, his voice cutting through the man's excuse. "Just trying to help? Just offering your professional opinion? Just making conversation?" George's tone made it clear that he wasn't buying any of those explanations. "Let me tell you what I think happened here tonight," George said. "I think you saw a young man with talent and courage, someone who was willing to get up on stage and share his heart with strangers, and something about that threatened you. Maybe it reminded you of dreams you gave up, or courage you never had, or opportunities you missed." The accuracy of George's assessment was written all over the talent scout's face. The man's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable recognition that his motivations had been exposed for what they really were. "So instead of supporting someone who was brave enough to chase his dreams," George continued, "you decided to tear him down. You used your knowledge of the industry not to help, but to hurt. And you did it publicly, in front of an audience, because you thought it would make you look smart and important." George paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "That's not just unprofessional, it's cruel. And it represents everything that's wrong with the way this business sometimes treats artists." The talent scout was staring at his hands now, unable to meet George's gaze or anyone else's. His companions had distanced themselves from him completely, clearly wanting no association with his behavior. "But here's the thing," George said, his voice becoming slightly less harsh. "We all make mistakes. We all have moments when we let our insecurities or frustrations get the better of us. The measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, it's how they respond when those mistakes are pointed out to them." George extended his hand toward the talent scout, offering a chance at redemption. "You have an opportunity right now to turn this situation into something positive. You can apologize to this young man, you can acknowledge that your criticism was inappropriate, and you can commit to using your platform more constructively in the future." The room held its breath, waiting to see how the talent scout would respond. This was his chance to salvage some dignity from the situation, to show that he was capable of growth and reflection. For a moment, it seemed like he might take George's offered olive branch. His face showed a mixture of shame and recognition, as if he were struggling with competing impulses. But then his pride reasserted itself, and he made the wrong choice. "Look, Mr. Strait," he said, his voice taking on a defensive tone. "I appreciate your perspective, but I stand by my assessment. The industry has standards, and not everyone who wants to be a country artist has what it takes. I was just being honest about the commercial realities." The disappointment in George's eyes was evident to everyone in the room. He had offered the man a way out, a chance to do the right thing, and it had been rejected. "I see," George said quietly. "Well, then let me be honest about some commercial realities of my own." George's voice took on the tone of someone who had run out of patience with nonsense. "In my 5 decades in this business, I've worked with every major label, every important promoter, and most of the significant industry professionals in Nashville and beyond. I've seen careers made and destroyed. I've watched trends come and go, and I've learned to recognize the difference between people who build up the industry and people who tear it down." The threat in George's voice was subtle but unmistakable. This wasn't just a legendary artist speaking. This was someone with real power and influence in the industry. "What happened here tonight will be remembered," George continued. "The way you treated this young man, the arrogance you displayed, the cruelty you showed, that will follow you. Because country music is a smaller community than most people realize, and word travels fast about people who can't be trusted to treat artists with respect." The talent scout's face went pale as he realized the implications of what George was saying. Being on the wrong side of George Strait wasn't just embarrassing, it could be career-damaging. "But more importantly," George said, turning away from the talent scout to address Marcus Rivera directly, "I want this young man to understand something crucial about this business and about life in general." George walked over to Marcus, placing a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Son, what happened here tonight wasn't about you or your music. It was about someone else's insecurity and fear. Your song was beautiful, your performance was genuine, and your story matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face as he tried to process having his musical hero not just defend him, but offer him personal encouragement. "I want you to remember this moment," George continued. "Not because of what that man said, but because of how everyone else in this room responded. Look around. These people were moved by your music. They connected with your story. That's what authenticity really looks like." George gestured toward the crowd, which was watching the interaction with obvious emotion. "These are your real critics, the people who come to hear music because they love it, not because they're looking for something to tear apart. These are the people whose opinions matter, because they're the ones who will support you throughout your career if you keep giving them honest, heartfelt music." Marcus wiped his eyes and managed to speak for the first time since the confrontation began. "Mr. Strait, I thank you. This means everything to me. Your music has been such an inspiration, and to have you defend me like this—" "You don't need to thank me," George replied with a warm smile. "You just need to keep doing what you're doing. Keep writing honest songs, keep telling your truth, and keep believing in yourself even when other people try to tear you down." George turned back to address the entire room one final time. "I want everyone here to remember something important. Country music belongs to all of us. The artists, the fans, the industry professionals, everyone who loves this music and wants to see it thrive. But it doesn't belong to anyone who wants to use it as a weapon to hurt other people." His voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for the entire genre. "We have a responsibility to protect and nurture new talent, not to destroy it. We have an obligation to support artists who are brave enough to share their hearts with us, not to punish them for daring to dream. And we have a duty to judge music by its emotional truth and artistic merit, not by the biographical details of the people who create it. The applause that followed was longer and more enthusiastic than anything that had happened all evening. People weren't just clapping for George's words, they were expressing their commitment to the values he had articulated. But George had one more surprise in store for everyone. As the applause finally died down, George Strait did something that no one in the room expected. He walked over to Marcus Rivera and gently took the guitar from the young man's hands. "Marcus," George said with a smile, "I hope you don't mind if I borrow this for a few minutes. There's something I want to share with everyone here tonight." The room erupted in excited murmurs as people realized what was about to happen. George Strait, the king of country music, was about to give an impromptu performance at a small songwriter night in San Antonio. It was the kind of moment that people would talk about for the rest of their lives. George adjusted the guitar strap and quickly tuned the instrument, his movements efficient and practiced. Even at 72, his hands moved with the confidence of someone who had been playing guitar for over 60 years. "You know," George said as he settled the guitar into position, "I came here tonight just to listen. I wasn't planning to perform, wasn't expecting to get involved in any drama, but sometimes life has other plans for you." He strummed the guitar once, the sound clear and true in the intimate venue. "What happened here tonight reminded me of something important, something I think we all need to remember. Music isn't just entertainment. It's not just a business or a career or a way to make money. Music is how we connect with each other, how we share our deepest emotions, how we make sense of the world around us." George began finger-picking a gentle melody, the notes floating through the room like a prayer. "I've been blessed to have a long career in this business, and I've sung a lot of songs over the years. But there's one song that I've never performed publicly, a song I wrote about 30 years ago during a difficult time in my life. I've kept it private because it was too personal, too raw. But after hearing Marcus's beautiful song about his grandfather tonight, I think it's time to share it." The room was completely silent now, everyone understanding that they were about to witness something unprecedented. George Strait had never been known for sharing deeply personal material, preferring to maintain a certain privacy even in his most intimate songs. "This song is called 'The Long Road Home,'" George said. "I wrote it after my son Bubba was injured in a car accident. He was in the hospital for weeks, and I spent a lot of time sitting by his bedside, thinking about family, about legacy, about what really matters in life." George's voice took on a deeper, more emotional quality as he began to sing. "I've traveled every highway from here to Tennessee, played my songs for millions, but tonight it's just for me, sitting by your bedside, watching you sleep, thinking about the promises that I was meant to keep." The melody was haunting and beautiful, with the kind of emotional depth that could only come from genuine experience. George's voice, while showing its age, still carried the power and authenticity that had made him a legend. "The long road home ain't always straight and true. Sometimes it's filled with fear of what we're gonna lose, but every mile we travel, every tear we cry, teaches us the meaning of the reasons why." As George continued singing, it became clear that this wasn't just a song. It was a masterclass in authentic songwriting. Every word carried weight, every note served the emotion of the piece, and the overall effect was devastating in its honesty. I thought success was measured by the lights and the crowd, by the records that I sold, and the praise that came so loud. But sitting in this silence, holding your hand tight, I know that love's the only thing that matters in this fight. Marcus Rivera was openly crying now, understanding that George was sharing something incredibly personal, not just with the room, but with him specifically. This was more than just a performance. It was a demonstration of what authentic artistry really looked like. So when you wake up, son, and the world seems dark and cold, remember that your story is more precious than gold, and the long road home will always lead you back to the love that never fades, no matter what you lack. As George finished the song, the silence in the room was profound. This wasn't the kind of silence that comes from uncertainty or discomfort. It was the silence of awe, of people processing something beautiful and meaningful. When the applause finally came, it was different from anything that had happened earlier in the evening. It was the kind of applause that comes from genuine emotional impact, from the recognition that something special had just occurred. George handed the guitar back to Marcus, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's what authenticity looks like," he said quietly. "It's not about your biographical details or your marketing strategy or your demographic appeal. It's about being willing to share the deepest parts of yourself, even when it makes you vulnerable." Marcus accepted the guitar with trembling hands, clearly overwhelmed by what had just happened. "But there's something else I want to say," George continued, addressing the entire room. "What Marcus did tonight, getting up on that stage and sharing his family's story, that took the same kind of courage it took for me to share that song just now. The only difference is that I had 50 years of success to fall back on, and he's just starting his journey." George looked directly at the talent scout, who had remained silent throughout the performance. "That's why what happened earlier was so wrong. This young man was being authentic in exactly the way that great country music demands. He was sharing truth, creating connection, and opening his heart to strangers, and instead of being supported for that courage, he was attacked for it." George's voice took on a tone of finality as he delivered his closing thoughts. "I want everyone here to remember this evening. Remember the difference between authentic artistry and manufactured entertainment. Remember the importance of supporting new talent instead of tearing it down. And remember that country music at its best is about inclusion, not exclusion." He turned to Marcus one final time. "Son, I want you to keep that song about your grandfather. I want you to sing it whenever you can, for as many people as will listen. Because that's a story that needs to be told, and you're the right person to tell it." Marcus nodded, finding his voice at last. "Mr. Strait, I don't know how to thank you for this. You didn't have to stand up for me, but you did, and it means everything." "You don't need to thank me," George replied. "You just need to remember this lesson and pay it forward someday when you see another young artist being treated unfairly." As George prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. The talent scout finally stood up and walked over to Marcus, his face showing genuine shame and remorse. "Marcus," the man said, his voice quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear, "I owe you an apology. What I said tonight was wrong, and it came from my own insecurities, not from any legitimate criticism of your music. Your song was beautiful, and you have real talent. I'm sorry for trying to tear you down." Marcus looked surprised but nodded graciously. "Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." The talent scout turned to George. "Mr. Strait, thank you for the lesson. I needed to hear it even though it was hard to take." George shook the man's hand. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them." As the evening wound down, people began approaching both George and Marcus. The young songwriter found himself surrounded by supportive fans, industry professionals who were genuinely interested in his music, and other artists who wanted to collaborate with him. George watched these interactions with satisfaction, knowing that the evening had accomplished something important. A young artist's confidence had been restored. A bully had been put in his place and potentially reformed, and everyone present had been reminded of what country music was really supposed to be about. Before leaving, George had one final conversation with Marcus. "I want you to have something," George said, pulling a business card from his wallet. "This is my manager's contact information. I'd like you to send him a recording of your grandfather song and a few others. I can't promise anything, but I think there are people who need to hear your music." Marcus stared at the card in amazement. "Mr. Strait, are you serious?" "Son, I don't joke about music. You've got something special and the world deserves to hear it. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." As George finally made his way to the door, the entire room gave him one final standing ovation. But this time, the applause wasn't just for his performance or his legendary status. It was for his demonstration of what it meant to use success and influence in service of something greater than yourself. Outside in the parking lot, George stood beside his truck for a moment, looking up at the stars that shone brightly over San Antonio. The evening had turned out very differently than he had expected, but it had reminded him of why he had fallen in love with country music in the first place. It wasn't about the fame or the fortune or the accolades. It was about the connection, the magical moment when a song bridges the gap between one human heart and another, when a story makes someone feel less alone in the world, when music reminds us of our shared humanity. As he drove home to his ranch, George reflected on the evening's events. He had defended a young artist, confronted a bully, and shared one of his most personal songs with a room full of strangers. But more importantly, he had been reminded that his responsibility as an elder statesman of country music went beyond just maintaining his own legacy. He had an obligation to protect and nurture the next generation of artists, to ensure that the values that had made country music great would continue to guide the genre into the future. Tonight had been a good start, but there was more work to be done. The road home was dark and quiet, with only the sound of his truck's engine and the distant howl of coyotes to break the silence. But George felt more content than he had in months, knowing that he had used his influence for something meaningful, something that would matter long after the evening's excitement had faded. Marcus Rivera would go on to have a successful career, always crediting that night at Floor's Country Store as the turning point when he learned what authentic artistry really meant. The talent scout would change his approach to working with artists, becoming known as someone who supported and developed new talent rather than tearing it down. And George Strait would continue to make occasional appearances at small venues, always looking for opportunities to support new artists and remind the music industry of its highest values. Because he had learned something important that night, that his greatest legacy wouldn't be his record sales or his awards, but the positive impact he could have on the next generation of country music artists. The King of Country Music had reminded everyone why he deserved that title, not just because of his commercial success, but because of his commitment to the values that made country music great: authenticity, humility, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. As he pulled into his driveway and saw the lights of his ranch house in the distance, George smiled. It had been a good night for country music, and an even better night for the human spirit.